My colleague expected to leave early every Friday because I have more of a social life than you. When I refused to cover for her, she labeled me bitter and boring to the entire office. I smiled and said, "Funny, since my social life doesn't involve dumping my work on others, enjoy explaining your incomplete tasks to the boss." I work at a marketing firm in Chicago, a city known for its towering skyscrapers and relentless pace. Our office, located in the heart of the Loop, buzzes with energy from dawn till dusk. Deadlines loom large and the pressure is constant. Among my colleagues, one person stands out, not for her dedication, but for her uncanny ability to evade responsibilities. Let's call her Sophie. Sophie is in her early 30s, with an air of confidence that borders on arrogance. She dresses impeccably, favoring designer brands that the rest of us could only dream of affording. Her long, chestnut hair is always perfectly styled, and she wears just enough makeup to highlight her sharp features. But beneath this polished exterior lies a master of manipulation. Every Friday, without fail, Sophie would find a reason to leave the office early. It became her routine. While the rest of us were buried under piles of work, she would saunter over, a smug smile playing on her lips. "Hey," she'd begin, her tone dripping with feigned innocence. "I have some plans this evening. Mind covering for me? You don't have much going on, right?" The first few times, I obliged. I believed in teamwork and assumed that, perhaps, she had genuine commitments. But as weeks turned into months, her early departures became more frequent and her excuses more trivial. One particularly hectic Friday, the office was a hive of activity. A major client presentation was due, and tensions were high. I was at my desk, juggling multiple tasks, when Sophie approached. "Hey," she said, placing a stack of files on my desk. "I need you to finish the client presentation for me. I have a date tonight and I can't be late." I looked up, incredulous. "Sophie, we're all swamped. This presentation is crucial. Can't you reschedule?" She let out a dismissive laugh. "Oh, come on. It's just one evening. Besides, I have more of a social life than you. You can handle this." Her words stung. It wasn't just the implication that my personal life was lacking, but the sheer audacity of her assumption. I felt a surge of frustration but swallowed it down. "All right," I muttered, taking the files. "I'll handle it." As she breezed out of the office, I couldn't shake the growing resentment. While she was out enjoying her evening, I was left to pick up the pieces, ensuring our team didn't fall short. The following week, the cycle continued. Sophie would offload her tasks onto unsuspecting colleagues, always with the same condescending rationale. "You don't mind, do you? I mean, it's not like you have plans." It wasn't just me she targeted. Others in the office began to grumble, their patience wearing thin. Yet, Sophie remained oblivious, wrapped up in her own world. One afternoon, during a team meeting, our manager, Mr. Daniels, addressed the upcoming project deadlines. He emphasized the importance of collaboration and meeting our commitments. Sophie, as usual, nodded along, but I noticed her sneaking glances at her phone, likely coordinating her next social outing. After the meeting, as we filed out of the conference room, Sophie sidled up to me. "Hey," she began, her voice sweet but insincere. "About that project Mr. Daniels mentioned. I might need you to handle my part. I have this thing on Friday." I stopped in my tracks, turning to face her. "Sophie, this is becoming a pattern. We're all working hard, and it's not fair for you to keep leaving us to cover for you." She rolled her eyes, clearly irritated. "Don't be so bitter and boring. Maybe if you had a social life, you'd understand." That was the breaking point. I felt a surge of determination. It was time for Sophie to face the consequences of her actions. Over the next few days, I began documenting every instance Sophie left early, noting the tasks she neglected and the colleagues she inconvenienced. I compiled emails, timestamps, and workload distributions. It was meticulous work, but I knew it was necessary. I also started gathering testimonials from other team members. Many were hesitant at first, fearing backlash, but as I shared my own experiences, they opened up. Stories poured in about missed deadlines, last-minute scrambles, and the undue stress Sophie's behavior had caused. With all the evidence in hand, I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Daniels. Sitting across from him in his office, I laid out my findings. "Mr. Daniels," I began, choosing my words carefully. "I've noticed a recurring issue that's affecting our team's productivity and morale." He raised an eyebrow, signaling for me to continue. "It's about Sophie," I said, sliding the folder of documentation across his desk. "She's been consistently leaving early on Fridays, offloading her responsibilities onto others. It's causing delays and fostering resentment among the team." Mr. Daniels opened the folder, scanning the contents. His expression grew serious as he flipped through the pages. "I wasn't aware of the extent of this," he admitted, looking up. "Thank you for bringing it to my attention. This is unacceptable." He leaned back in his chair, contemplating. "I'll address this immediately. Your dedication to the team doesn't go unnoticed." Feeling a mix of relief and apprehension, I nodded. "I appreciate that, sir." The next day, an email from Mr. Daniels landed in everyone's inbox, announcing a mandatory team meeting that afternoon. The atmosphere in the office was tense, with whispers circulating about this sudden gathering. At 3 p.m., we assembled in the conference room. Mr. Daniels stood at the front, his demeanor stern. "I've become aware of certain behaviors that are undermining our team's efficiency and cohesion," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Let me be clear, shirking responsibilities and relying on colleagues to pick up the slack will not be tolerated." Though he didn't name her, all eyes flicked towards Sophie. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her usual confidence replaced with unease. "Moving forward," Mr. Daniels continued, "I expect everyone to fulfill their duties and respect their colleagues' time and efforts. Let's work together to maintain the high standards we've set for this firm." The meeting concluded, and as we filed out, Sophie avoided eye contact, her face flushed. The message had been received loud and clear. In the weeks that followed, Sophie remained noticeably subdued. She stayed late on Fridays, diligently completing her tasks. The office atmosphere improved, with a renewed sense of fairness and collaboration. One evening, as I was packing up to leave, Sophie approached my desk. Gone was her usual smugness. Instead, she appeared contemplative. "Hey," she began softly. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much I was affecting everyone." I studied her for a moment, gauging the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that, Sophie. It means a lot." She nodded, offering a small, genuine smile before returning to her desk. From that day on, Sophie became a more integral part of the team, not just in presence but in effort. It was a reminder that sometimes, standing up and addressing issues head-on can lead to positive change, fostering a healthier and more respectful work environment. Things were peaceful for a while after that. Sophie showed up on time, finished her work, and even started helping out when others got overloaded. People were surprised. A few coworkers even started warming up to her. I wasn't expecting us to become friends, but at least things were civil, productive, less exhausting. But the thing about people like Sophie is, change doesn't always stick. About a month later, we got a new client. Big one. National retailer, tight deadlines, big expectations. Our team was split into two groups to handle the campaign strategy and rollout. Mr. Daniels put me in charge of one group. Sophie was in the other. At first, it felt like healthy competition. She worked late again, spoke up more in meetings, and for once, she didn't flake out when things got tough. But I noticed something weird. Whenever I submitted updates, the feedback from the client started getting icy. Questions came up about whether deadlines were being missed or if numbers didn't add up. I double-checked everything. I knew my group was on track. Still, the doubt lingered. Then one day, my intern, Lila, sharp and way too observant, walked into my office, shutting the door behind her. "You didn't hear this from me," she said quietly, "but Sophie's been talking to the client." "What do you mean?" I asked. "She's been calling them directly." I overheard her in the break room. She said you've been dropping the ball and that her group could take over if things go south. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to believe it, but Sophie had always been clever. Charm people, control the story, twist facts just enough. If she was making me look incompetent, it explained this sudden change in tone from the client. I needed proof. So I did what any quietly furious, detail-obsessed person would do. I started recording our own project calls legally with team consent. I saved every email, logged every change. I even encouraged my group to copy Mr. Daniels on key updates, just to keep him in the loop. Then I started watching Sophie. She was careful, but not careful enough. I overheard her one afternoon on a call with someone from the client side. She was in an empty conference room, but I caught enough from outside the door. She was blaming our team for delays that never happened, claiming we were slowing the project down. That was the final push. I didn't go straight to Mr. Daniels. This time, I wanted a full picture. I spent a weekend compiling side-by-side comparisons, our actual progress versus Sophie's claims. I even included timestamps, showing when she'd spoken with the client, right after our updates would be sent. The most damning piece? An email Sophie sent the client where she accidentally attached a version of our report with deliberate errors inserted. I found the original on our shared drive. Hers had numbers changed, charts altered. It was subtle, but it was sabotage. I printed it all out and slid the thick packet into a folder labeled Campaign Discrepancies. I waited until the next team leadership meeting, with Mr. Daniels, both group leads, and the project director present. When the client's issues came up again, I calmly said, "Actually, I've compiled some information that might explain the confusion." Sophie looked up sharply. I handed Mr. Daniels the folder. Silence fell as he flipped through it. Page after page. His eyes narrowed. He looked over at Sophie, who was suddenly sitting very still. "What is this?" he asked. She stammered. "I don't know what this is." "That's not. Those reports must be a mistake." He didn't say anything right away. He just kept reading. The project director, a no-nonsense woman named Carla, turned to me. "You're saying these changes were intentional?" I nodded. "The original files are on the shared drive. The edits don't match the version history. Only one person had access to both versions." The room was dead quiet. Everyone knew who I meant. Sophie tried to recover. She claimed she was trying to simplify things for the client. She said maybe she misunderstood the data. But it didn't matter. The documents spoke for themselves. Mr. Daniels didn't explode. He didn't yell. That wasn't his style. But his voice dropped low when he finally said, "We'll talk privately after this." Sophie left the room with him. The rest of us sat there stunned. Carla turned to me and said, "Good instincts. That could have cost us the whole contract." I gave a small nod. I wasn't smiling. Later that afternoon, Sophie returned to her desk, pale-faced and quiet. She didn't say a word to anyone. Packed up her things. Walked out. But it wasn't over. A week passed. Then we got HR involved. And then came the email. But I'll get to that. The email hit our inboxes on a Wednesday morning. The subject line was vague, update regarding internal matters, but the tension it brought was immediate. It wasn't from HR. It was from Sophie. Apparently, Sophie hadn't been fired. She'd been relocated to a different branch of the company. Still under the same umbrella, just not in our building anymore. Some office in Dallas. The message was stiff, corporate, and most likely ghostwritten by legal or HR. She looked forward to new challenges and was grateful for her time in Chicago. No apology. No mention of the damage. Just a carefully edited sign-off. Everyone moved on, or pretended to. The project went back on track. We fixed the numbers, calmed the client, got our delivery schedule locked in again. But things didn't feel right. I'd get this nagging sense every time I opened a shared doc or replied to a company-wide email. Like someone was still watching. Then weird things started happening. The first was small, just a comment on a shared Google document. It was an old draft from the campaign, one that hadn't been touched in weeks. Out of nowhere, a new comment popped up from a user with a scrambled username. It said, Don't trust the numbers. She lies too. I thought it was a glitch. Maybe a spam bot. I deleted it. No big deal. But then one of my junior analysts came to me concerned. He'd noticed odd edits on the server. Documents rolling back to outdated versions. Presentation slides rearranged. Even emails in our shared inbox flagged incorrectly, as if someone was going through and undoing our work. IT brushed it off as syncing errors. Until I found my own Slack messages copied, word for word, into a different channel, a private one I wasn't part of. I dug deeper. Turned out, Sophie still had limited back-end access to our shared platforms. Some oversight during the relocation process. Her credentials hadn't been fully revoked. She was watching us. Interfering. Quietly. I gathered screenshots, logs, and file histories, then marched straight to IT. They confirmed it. She'd been logging in remotely, copying files, commenting anonymously, even accessing meeting recordings. They revoked her access on the spot, or so they said. 2 days later, my email account was flagged for suspicious activity. HR called me in. We received a report that you've been tampering with shared company assets and communicating directly with the client without authorization. I almost laughed until I saw the screenshots they showed me. Messages I never sent. Edits I never made. Emails forwarded under my name. She was framing me. Sophie had downloaded everything before her access got cut. And now, she was using it to twist the narrative. Make it look like I'd been the problem all along. That I was retaliating. Sabotaging the team. Misleading the client. HR told me I was on temporary leave while they investigated. They took my badge. I walked out of the building in a daze. Back home, I sat in silence for a while. Just me, a cold coffee, and the sinking realization that Sophie wasn't done with me yet. She was better at this than I thought. But she underestimated one thing. I never delete anything. And I definitely don't forget. The next 2 weeks were the slowest of my life. I sat at home, rereading every email, every message, every file I'd saved from the office. I couldn't believe I was the one suspended while Sophie sat in a different state, quietly feeding lies through the back door. She was smart. Calculated. She left just enough evidence to make it all look real, like I'd been behind the errors, the communication breakdown, everything. But she also made one mistake. She underestimated how much I prepared. I'd been saving everything, just in case she tried something again. I had full version histories. Timestamps. Logs of her login times, edits she made, hidden comments, even an audio clip I forgot I'd recorded during one of our meetings. She'd muttered under her breath that day, thinking no one heard. But my mic caught it. I could destroy her if I wanted to. It wasn't much. But it was enough. I put together a report. It was 97 pages long. Every lie. Every fake message. Every time she'd manipulated files. I even included metadata from the documents she edited under fake accounts. It linked directly back to her company laptop, still pinging from Dallas. I didn't send it to HR. I sent it to the legal department. I also sent a sanitized version, just the key screenshots and proof, to the client we'd nearly lost. Anonymously. Within days, everything blew up. HR called me back. Legal had stepped in. Turns out, Sophie didn't just fake messages. She accessed confidential client data, altered it, forwarded documents to a private email address. That's a felony. And the client? They were furious. They wanted her gone. Not just transferred, gone. They also wanted me reinstated. The email they received laid it all out. They saw through her act. I walked back into the office with my head high, but the mood was tense. People looked at me differently. Some apologized. Others avoided me. I didn't care. 2 days later, news broke. Sophie had been terminated, effective immediately. But that wasn't the end. Turns out, the private email she used? It was tied to a side business. A consulting gig where she resold campaign strategies, our strategies, rewritten just enough to look new. She was stealing company work and selling it. Legal got involved. The company sued. Her name was blacklisted from every major agency in the state. She lost her job, her license, everything. The final blow? A friend of mine, who freelanced on and off, found Sophie's resume on a job board a few months later. She'd changed her name slightly and moved to New Mexico. We reported it. The company who'd just hired her dropped her the same day. That should have been enough. But I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I came to losing everything. I let my guard down once. I didn't speak up earlier. I let her dump her work on me for months before I pushed back. That was my mistake. I didn't fight fast enough. It won't happen again. I got promoted 3 months after everything settled. I didn't celebrate. Because when someone like Sophie crosses your path, it teaches you something. Sometimes you don't just protect yourself. You make sure they never come back.